Well, welcome, Josh. We're excited to have you.
Very excited to be here as well on a Saturday morning.
All right, so we're gonna jump in first so that our listeners can learn a little bit more who you are. So both personally and professionally, tell us about yourself.
Sure. So my name's Josh Chou. I grew up in New Jersey. I'm the son of a Chinese immigrant and a mom from Maine. I have an older sister and who is a PhD that now does HR work. And so neither of us have really continued our career in the way that we had started them. I went to school in New Jersey at Princeton. I'm a chemical engineer by education. And I think my last real dip of engineering occurred somewhere after 2 or 3 weeks of starting work. I spent about 10 years working out of Cincinnati at Procter& and Gamble, doing manufacturing and a number of other different things. About moved from there to moved and P&G sold the facility I was working in, which was their oldest manufacturing facility. So I've never really gotten to work in a new facility, only really old ones. And I went with a contract manufacturer that bought it. So they were bought by a couple of self-described good old boys from Perth, Ontario, Canada. And so I worked on the small side, on a contract manufacturing side for about 6 years. So I did a manager for about 3 years. I led supply chain and new business development for them for another 3 years after that. Really exciting opportunity. I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to explore that a little bit more later. At some point, decided maybe it was time to shift gears into a different part of the industry, maybe a little bit bigger company. So I spent about 14 years working for General Mills after that. Moved from Cincinnati to Minnesota, where I'm still currently located, at least some of the time. Really exciting series of opportunities between kind of operations, commercialization. I continued improvement for a little while and then had the privilege to live overseas for about 5.5 years in Switzerland and led our Europe and Australia supply chain. Came back and really wanted to continue to expand my global experience. And so I moved from General Mills to McCormick, where I am now. And so I'm currently the Chief Supply Chain Officer at McCormick. I've been here for about 3 years and in this role little over 18 months. I'm married. My wife, Rebecca, has worked at most of the same companies that I've worked for in a mix of procurement and HR. She is really my procurement knowledge base, since I really have not spent a ton of time working in that function within the supply chain. And then I have two sons who are Walker and Cody. Walker just graduated from CU Boulder. If there's anybody listening to the podcast that needs an econ major with a business minor, he's definitely looking for a role. And then my younger son, Cody, is at Cal Poly and studying computer science.
Okay,
All
so
right.
a couple things. Fun fact, Josh was my boss twice, so that was amazing. And he's been just a great ally mentor for Katie and I. Also, I always learn something new about people that we think we know. So I always forget you're from New Jersey. You don't give off like New Jersey vibes.
That's central New Jersey. So when you live in central New Jersey, you get the two ends of New York and Philly canceling out, and so you kind of lose the accent
Oh,
if you're not home enough.
yeah. I was talking to someone else about New Jersey about you don't pump your own gas, which I find to be kind of amazing. It's like Katie's always like, these are little fun facts that I find interesting.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so I always like that. I didn't know about your sister. She sounds super smart. We should invite her on.
Somebody had to be the PhD super studier, and somebody had to not. I was the not. My dad was PhD, and so she followed those education footsteps, which was great.
Okay, so Josh, when you are talking to your family that is like, what do you do every day? So how do you, or people on the street, how would you describe in layman's terms, like, what do you do?
So I probably have a different set of terms now that I might have had earlier on. I tell folks now that in my current role, it really is about setting the vision, enabling my team, and removing barriers. Because the reality is, I don't make any product, I don't sell any product, I don't move any product, I'm not packing or shipping. My sole role is to make sure that the folks on my team are clear about where we're going, have what they need, and when something gets in their way and there's a role I can play in helping to fix it, that's what I do. Now, in the broader sense, I have the privilege of being responsible for the buying of stuff, the making of stuff, the shipping of stuff, et cetera. But the reality is I'm at best an enabler of that, and hopefully at minimum not a barrier.
All right.
So we've both known you a long time, Josh, and you've had a chance to work across all these different companies and across, I'm thinking, and even like some folks that have come in from other companies and worked at the ones that you worked at. I'm thinking about like a Denise Holloman or something like that. Who are some of the women that have inspired you? It could actually be outside of work as well. And what have you learned from them?
So I'll start with the fact that despite working in supply chain operations, which you might typically view as, oh, it's probably more male dominated, I'll bet you I'm at least 50-50. So my first like kind of coach boss was Adele Suttle, who actually works here in Minnesota and could be a great guest on the show. And then Jaretha Johnson at P&G. And so Jaretha was my first kind of, call it, big official boss when I was at Procter& and Gamble. And Jaretha took no prisoners in her role, right? She was the department manager and the ops manager for the hydrolyzer. And this was probably the crustiest group of, if you think about process-oriented operations, they don't tend to have a lot of diversity in them. And so Doretha was a great coach for me in terms of helping me set up for how do you engage your employee base, but not so far as that you're going to find yourself catering to all of their needs, right? It's that whole idea about being a coach versus a friend, especially in the manufacturing environment, which can be challenging. And she was fantastic for that in my overall growth. Certainly, Courtney, you talked about Denise Holloman. Denise, I don't know any of the exact details on how I was fortunate enough to be able to move into General Mills, but I'm fairly certain that she was part of the discussion as well as kind of shepherding my first couple of assignments. Denise was one of the earliest people that gave me really harsh feedback, right? So normally you get kind of nice feedback about really trying hard and maybe think about this. And I remember sitting down with her and having her tell me that I show up in meetings like a mad professor. It's happened to me today, right, where I'm not really prepared. And she's like, you can't go into meetings and just sort of, and she's flailing her arms around and really telling me that maybe I should be a little more thoughtful about how I show up. But she was also probably the most inspirational in terms of, I would say, encouraging me that I can do far more than I might think I'm capable of, right? I mean, I think like a lot of folks, each job I've had, I'm like, wow, this is actually higher than I thought I was going to get. Yeah, I worked for Becky O'Grady, I worked for Bethany, I worked for Dana. I haven't worked for a woman yet at McCormick, but we just have a relatively small pool given that I worked for the CEO. Each time I would say the biggest thing for me is that idea that being effective takes a combination of navigating your space, right? And I think that typically, I personally believe in supply chain, it takes more thought and intention for women. I think men can kind of barrel their way through that dynamic, and I just think it is tougher for different groups. Navigating your space, but navigating it not with an eye towards the fact that you have to be on your back foot or be defensive, but it's navigating it with a purpose and intention. So that's probably one of the biggest things I've taken away.
Thank you. The other thing about Denise was always like that TPM book and her knowledge of what page it was on and what, I mean, it's like, I think that's the first person I met at that level that I was like, you are like a genius and like just understand things in a way that I think a lot of leaders at that level don't. And her understanding and ability to coach it is quite amazing to this day. So
Absolutely.
Agree.
All right, Josh. So you talked about your career journey. And so working in manufacturing, engineering, different companies. Talk about what are like one or the two pivotal moments or experiences that kind of shaped how you show up today as a supply chain CSCO.
Okay, probably the first one. So I had left, maybe there's three. So very early on in my journey, we were deploying AM and PM I was a department manager. And I remember standing in front of our boards. There were paper boards then. Like nothing was digitized. Like you were literally having to make marks on the board. And we were tracking overtime. And at the time when I was at P&G, if you were more than 2% overtime, it was a sin. Like it could not be more than 2%. And I remember our supply chain VP coming in and reviewing results, and I was explaining why I couldn't reach better than whatever I was, 3.5%. And his comment was, if you had a choice between fixing this target and death, do you think you could do it better? Okay, literally, that was the term. Now, I say this in the context of what I learned was there's probably different ways of setting boundaries other than that. And like, I don't know that he certainly wasn't serious in it, but I think it was one of those things where I started thinking through this fact that your dropping of little bombs as a senior leader can be maybe impactful in a different way than you really intended. And so that was probably a core early step for me. I would say one of the biggest ones, right? I'm an engineer by education. I've worked in operations, it's my first 10 or 15 years or so only in operations. And I had left P&G. We're in a small privately held company. I was the plant manager, and I'm on vacation. We had my eldest son and my wife and I just found out we're expecting our second son. And I get a call from our plant finance manager, our plant controller, and he says, Josh, we're out of money. What do you mean we're out of money? I've worked for big companies. Like, you don't run out of money. You might miss your target there. And he said, we're out of money. And then he described to me, basically, we had gotten into a cash imbalance, and our payables were not offsetting with our sellables, our inventory had gotten too high, and we literally couldn't pay bills. And so I was like, I'd never thought about numbers or our targets relative to running the business. I'd always thought about them relative to targets. And so and I'm picturing, of course, at this point, I'm going to come back home. The gates will be locked. I'd encourage all these people on my team to join us in this journey to go to this other company. And I didn't sleep for 2 straight days. But it helped me realize that it's important to understand your role beyond the targets that are set. It really is important to understand the why behind it. And that's actually helped me, I think, as I talk to folks, because again, as you work for a larger company, you get very target focused. And that gets you in a position of feeling that sometimes the targets are fair or unfair. I don't know why they did this to us. And so that was my first realization of there was no they. It was literally that some of these numbers actually matter, because if you get it balanced right, if you aren't actually thinking about the consequences, it has very real and material consequences, not just, oh, I'll get a slightly lower performance review. So that was certainly a compelling opportunity for me. I think I said...
George, I have never heard that story from you before.
Me neither.
I'm just like, what?
It was a gut check. Hopefully, I don't know whether Norm's listening to that, but Norm was the one that called me. I'm like, oh, it was just not a good situation.
Yeah, well, I feel like too, I'm like having some memories of getting coached actually by you as you came to some of our sites when you were in continuous improvement. And I always felt like one of the questions you always asked was the why behind a target or a KPI. Like, why are you trying to hit this? And it's like, well, because the AM workbook said. And so anyways, that's sort of like clicking for me for now, because I always think, because in a couple different sites you had done that, where you really wanted to know the why and if we understood the context behind it and connecting those dots. So I just feel like I learned something new and connected another dot.
Definitely why I was doing it.
Yes, I do think, though, being engineers and technical people, we do get very fixated on targets. And I do think, to your point, Katie, especially when it gets filtered down, we're just like, okay, like they told us this is what it is. I'm assuming
so we go do it. Yeah.
And we go almost ruthlessly go after it. And I do feel like filtering it, especially down to the manufacturing floor, in a way that that was another, I think, aha, as we went through continuous improvement journey when I was at the plants. It's like, if you don't make it real for them, like RNS and profit, sometimes like they're like, okay, but what do you need me to do on this line today? And to your point, why? But I do think we do get, and this all we talk about the metrics. We will fixate on a KPI or metric because we can go after it and like, yes. But then we're like, oh, we just missed it. And it's like, no, that missing it actually can be more impactful.
You didn't sell a case, which means you didn't make money, which means you can't pay bills.
Right. Yeah, you asked me. So the last one was, and I think that you guys are probably experiencing this now. I just actually coached somebody on it this week. Is I just moved over to Europe, and I've been used to running operations, and then kind of operations and planning. But there's always some functions that were not my responsibility to have to deal with. And we had something had happened, and there was a sourcing problem, like some procurement material hadn't come through, or I don't remember what it was. And I remember my first reaction was, God, thank goodness it wasn't me. That's those guys. And then I'm like, oh, crud, that's me now, too. So I literally remember walking to the corner office for the region president, and I was like halfway there thinking I'd have to explain this problem, but I'd be comfortable because it was sort of my responsibility, but somebody else to deal with. And then by a third of the way there, by almost all the way there, I realized, nope, this is actually mine. And so I had to kind of make that big pivot of how you show up. And so I think it's one of these things where it is, to your point about being in different functions, you can get siloed in a way that you will at times breathe a sigh of relief. Well, at least that's not me, right? And even now in supply chain, I think, well, missed our sales number, at least that's not me. And I think that the adjustment that I've continued to try to make is the reality is, even if it's not my direct responsibility, the miss is probably gonna have consequences on me. So I probably ought to be thinking about, no matter whose fault it is there anything I can do to help solve the problem? Because I will bear the brunt of the consequences no matter who it is. Now, more and more, as my role has expanded, more of it is me. But there's still those things that are not my responsibility, but I still feel the pain of if it doesn't go well, so I better be figuring out how to help.
Agree. I think too, sometimes as you were talking through that one, sometimes we do get caught up in our silos, even within supply chain, but then even beyond that, right? Oh, they didn't hit sales, that's sales or that's brand. And I'm like, man, that just shines a bigger light on supply chain. Because if you miss a case, we could have counted that one, feel it.
And I'm like, is it a refile or a real case? Just kidding. I don't ask that.
None of us do. None of us ever ask that question.
Okay, so one of the threads, I think, coming all the way from like your P&G days, is this focus on continuous improvement and leadership there. Has your philosophy around continuous improvement, has it changed as you think about, you've had to embed a continuous improvement culture in different places and how that might look? Anything you've learned from that?
I talk to folks about this, whether it's internally or as I'm recruiting folks, et cetera. And I rightly or wrongly believe there's two styles of continuous improvement. There's the TPM, HPO style of continuous improvement, and then there's the Lean Six Sigma style of continuous improvement. Both have value, both I think drive fantastic results. You can go in any given company and see fantastic improvements because of them. I think part of it because of my background, I'm still a TPM, HPO based person, which is how I started at P&G. It's how I did work at the contract manufacturer, is what I do today. And the reason I think it's so powerful is it really is about, I remember somebody describing it, was probably Denise, that talks about AM is a methodology to train and engage people through fixing equipment. And that kind of core element of it, of this idea that the biggest power that we have in continuous improvement isn't the result, It's in how we are engaging people, improving their lives, building their capability that honestly gives me energy. And so the nice thing for me is it's an easy topic to weave into almost any area, any function. And I tell my organization now is we'll have a specific continuous improvement path. For us, it's our journey to excellence. And there's tools and processes, but there is this foundational thought process you have to have around it that impacts how you think about safety, how you think about quality, how you think about your engagement surveys, that if you don't have this fundamental ethos about it, then it's going to hard to understand. Like if you're constantly just thinking about what's the exact tool I can apply here versus what's the kind of core ethos. And so I hate to say that it hasn't evolved over time, but it's probably more solidified. And I find that folks that come from a different style CI background, it can just be challenging because it's not that it does take a certain amount of translation, and they do have different, I think they have the same goals, but their path to get there is different. And so I just find that it is easier for me to mesh operationally if they share the same core kind of fundamental beliefs around continuous improvement as I do.
Yeah, similar to you, I think when we were benchmarking and we went to, I'm going to mess up all the levels now, but to see the people evolve in their capability from the different stages as they progressed. And I think hearing their stories about how, especially people that had been in the workforce for a long time, just changed their life at home as well. And I think that to me is really compelling when you see that we're just not teaching them a skill for them to be really good at their job at work, but people that were more confident in their abilities to fix things at home or do things at home that they would never do. To me, I was like, okay, like this feels like a bigger mission and a bigger than just like, okay, get more stuff out for us and that type of thing. So I do think that was, as we got to talk to people, and then people like, a lot of people do want different things. Like I think sometimes we can sit in corporate and forget, and I think COVID opened our eyes to this, that everyone wants flexibility, not just like people that work in an office. Everybody wants career progression, not everybody, but a lot of people want to feel challenged and valued at work. And I do think TPM gives a good backbone for that because I think all those things came to life through that process that we were able to see.
This woman, Joan Stapleton, who worked at the P&G factory, her unit op was this like ancient wrapper. And like people talk about, oh, our equipment's old. I mean, literally, this is in the mid 90s, and this piece of equipment was at least from the 60s, right? It was this super old wrapper. But she started early on in equipment ownership. She had no mechanical skills before us kind of kicking off AM. But she would be like the go-to person because she would pull out her book. She would talk about the AM. She would show like the peak parts that she helped rebuild on the wrapper. Anytime you had a tour, you knew that Joan, like you didn't ask her. She would expect that she wants to be able to talk about her. And so her ownership, what she's learned. And she was always so excited about it that, so for me, it comes down to the more you can foster that, like, it's the point. Am I getting a better outcome? Probably. But am I making and it's not even me. Has this individual had the opportunity to make their own lives better? That was so exciting.
Yeah. To me, it's higher purpose work. And I think if you can remember that and that ripple effect that it's going to have versus just passing like the checklist and the test and things like that, it does become so much more meaningful. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to switch a little bit to allyship. No, Josh, the purpose of our podcast is to amplify voices of women in this field that we love. And so can you talk about what allyship means to you and then what experiences have helped shape your commitment to it? Because it's not something I think Katie and I, probably you've seen, if you're not intentional about it, it doesn't happen. And we've been, I think, really blessed to be around leaders that really supported us, advocated for us, made us feel comfortable to feel like this is where we belong. So we'd just love to hear about your view on allyship and like what experiences helped shape that.
This is a tougher question. So, I mean, my view on allyship, and I talk about it within our organization, whether it's on our corporate leadership team or within my team, about the fact that it has to be an active process. And honestly, it needs to be an active process that if it's not making you feel a little uncomfortable, then you're probably not doing it right. I really recently went to I did 2 women's network events at our company, both of which one of them's like a lunch and learn, and I walk in and I'm the only one. There's not other men that are actively part of it, but it's that first step of walking in and realizing like, oh, I've got to kind of navigate this space. And I'll get to that in the story in a bit. It's that idea that you have to, as an ally, be vulnerable and be willing to put yourself out there. It's not good enough to just say it in a big room, hey, I'm an advocate for folks, or even to say it in front of them in some broader context. I think it's finding some of those smaller experiences that puts you in a feeling of discomfort that allows you to better understand the dynamic. So it's easy to be an ally from the top. I think it's a little bit harder to be an ally as you're kind of navigating that space. I think one of the questions was as for why, and this is going to sound bad, and I really hate to say it to your faces, but it's really easy to be an ally for people that are going to carry a ton of weight for you on the team. And so honestly, from my standpoint, I've had really great women that I've had the opportunity to either work with or to have to kind of bring onto my team and do fantastic work. And so I advertise myself as trying to be the laziest leader possible, right? I say this in job interviews now, whatever my current job, because my goal is to figure out people that are highly energized to do great work and are hugely capable. And I've been privileged in that I've very frequently had that opportunity. I think over half of my direct reports right now are women. So I've got women running the supply chain in APAC, global planning logistics, our North America region. And it wasn't because I was just like, oh, the only way I'll fill this role is with a woman. I have been over it with our team to say we will continue to try to build out the diversity of our organization to match the communities that we live in. And so that's been our overall operating model. But I've also been pretty privileged in terms of how I think that's played out for us. But I do think that allyship is key. I just came back from Europe, was visiting our French facilities. We have 3 facilities in the area. 2 are in this area that we operate in. 2 plants are run by women. 1 plant is run by a guy. But I think he's the only male on his entire leadership team, right? So like literally his head of operations, head of quality. And so you kind of begin to see this dynamic of, which has nothing to do with me. This Denis Gontier in the region has done a ton of great work, but this idea that it takes a small, honest to goodness, a small amount of effort from an allyship to be able to identify leaders and bring them to the forefront. And they're getting a ton of value from it. And these are organizations where, again, the bulk of the workforce is they're still manufacturing process oriented. So it's not like it's an all female workforce, but I'm finding now that more and more leaders that are discovering this idea that allyship creates value and frankly creates the opportunity to just deliver a lot more benefit. And that's not to say that there's not great men in our organization as well, but I think it takes more effort and intentionality to ensure that you're building out that gender balance.
So as you're doing this and other people are listening, do you have any advice? Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you be more intentional about it? How do you become a better ally so that you are creating a more like inclusive like industry? So across supply chains, as you're talking with other CSCOs, things like that, what insights would you offer?
Ooh, I have a part to that.
Ooh,
And then how do you do that in a way to not disenfranchise the rest of the org?
that's a great question.
Well, can we stick with just Katie?
No.
I do think the first part starts with this premise of vulnerability. It starts with this idea that you can't just sit in a talent review and say, oh, we have to have more women working here, right? You can't just show up once a year for the women in supply chain event, and especially when it's on a Zoom call, and make sure your face is there. I do think that you have to be willing to have the conversations. I think you have to be willing to show up as the minority in the room, because I do think that's an important shared experience to have. I think that you have to be willing also to be listening. So when we go to plant visits, we do what we call 1 to 20s, where you kind of come to the room, they're bringing 20 leaders. Sometimes they're technicians, sometimes they're kind of first or second line leaders. And the intention is you just open the door for their discussion for the next hour. And what it does reveal then is both this idea that about maybe gender imbalance, or sometimes racial imbalance, sometimes it's age imbalance, sometimes experience. But I think it's important that you go into those experiences listening and not trying to solve the problems, nor trying to discount the reality of the problems. And I think that specific experience helps you think through, I would say, working through the challenges of being a more overt ally. And then I think you just have to make a personal choice as well to say, hey, look, is this something that's important to me? And to be clear, it may not be important to everybody. I'd love it if that were the case. I'd love it if we had world peace as well, and economic equality, and a number of other things. Because we don't, though, I don't think it means that I shouldn't be personally taking a role here, because it's important for me. Courtney, you had a second question, which you have to repeat, so that I don't, because it was the harder one that I was trying to avoid.
Yeah, I think you kind of alluded to this earlier. How do you make sure you're an ally for women, but then don't disenfranchise the broader organization? Because I think we've all heard the jokes, or like, well, I want the men's forum group or whatever they want. And so I think with every joke, and there's some reality there in how people are feeling. So I'm just wondering, as you said, as a man, now you're a man of color, which is different, but how do you think about making sure the rest of your group feels valued as well and feels like they're getting advocated for?
It's a couple of things. One of the advantages of what we would traditionally, maybe historically, call diversity groups, we can call them inclusion groups, is that they often get some additional support and often develop great tools. Well, those are things that we can apply everywhere. And so I frequently or have been encouraged to take career maps or other elements that people have developed in one portion of the organization and say, hey, there's nothing secret about this. We can make this available for everybody. And I think that encouraging folks to reapply across the various groups to the entire community has been super important. We do more work now in my current company since we're fortunate in the Asian diversity group at McCormick, in that we have 4 senior leaders on the exec team that all could potentially fall into those groups. Some of them cross over into Asian and Hispanic groups and other groups, but we've done a ton within our group and are now kind of expanding, therefore, what we do. How do we engage with other groups? How do we cross over the various diversity groups? And we can be very overt in terms of how we can bring anybody into the pool. So we have people of all gender, race, background, et cetera, beginning to attend events just because we've kind of built some momentum. So I think this idea about building momentum, and in the course of building momentum, you increase the inclusiveness of your group is super helpful. And then the other piece, as I mentioned before, it's that ideas, tools or tools that you develop in one given subset that you're overtly looking to bring it to life across the rest of the organization.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to easier questions, I think, maybe. At least the first one.
I read this question. This one's going to be hard for me.
No, this one's easy, I think. So we ask a lot of people, a lot of our guests, like there's so much information. There's books, podcasts, there's conferences to attend. You could be inundated. And so as you think about your role, staying on top of all the trends and what's happening, how do you filter through that noise? What are the key things or resources that you tap into regularly and you recommend for our listeners?
There's a reason I said this was the hardest question.
Oh, this is
So I listen to this podcast and like Conan O'Brien and I keep trying to do more work-based content podcasts, and I'll dip in and out of it, but it's not super high. Honestly, I pull in news feed each day and I'll check into that. The books that I always recommend to people are books that I read 15 or 20 years ago. So I'm probably less tuned in on a daily basis to some external piece other than news. But I also leverage, we've got relationships with a number of external industry groups that are good at compiling information. They're good at connecting me as well with other individual leaders in our industry or outside of our industry of a similar basis. And what's nice about those is if, I won't name it, Company X, if you go to a very large conference sponsored by Company Y, you'll hear this amazing presentation about the fantastic work they're doing. And I have the privilege through other industry groups to be able to talk to the leader in that space, and they'll say, hey, yeah, these are some things that we think have really worked well, but here's all the things that, in fact, we've struggled with that you don't ever have insight to when you go to the conference and they present this, fantastic work. And so honestly, the privilege I have right now is that because of, I think there's probably 6 groups that are nominally called CSCO groups that I get invited to, that you get to sit and listen to people and talk to peers, but also listen to experts coming in and tell you their view on what's going on. And that's probably one of the more consistent things that I do, but it is that peer-to-peer discussion that I think adds a ton of value for me, because it's good to be able to hear that all the things that are presented are not maybe quite as rosy as that, or not quite as comprehensive as it's being presented in the larger setting. And I get energy from that, as well as the nuggets of, but you should still really focus on this piece of it.
Okay, Josh, what is your favorite book then? You said you had a book from
my favorite workbook or my favorite book?
Either.
I really
like both.
Workbook. Seeing yourself as other people do.
Oh, that's a good one.
All right, Carol Kears here in Minnesota. I give that to folks all the time. It was a great comeuppance for me in terms of that difference between how you think you're showing up and how it comes across to other people, and the value of understanding and knowing that. I really like the book The Power of One by Bryce Courtney. I think he's only written like one book. I looked it up before. It's about a kid growing up in South Africa.
Nice. All right.
I did have a follow-up question on your industry stuff. So I know you get invited to these forums. Do you maintain those connections afterwards or in between? Because that's a question we get a lot is, how do you build your network? How do you maintain your network? So any nuggets there you'd want to share?
I think it's like any mentoring relationship where there's some that you connect with and you're like, yeah, I'm going to keep doing that one. And there's some that are like, well, that was interesting and I'm kind of done. And my default is always to try to stay connected. I think, as you both know, but however many listeners we have to this particular episode won't know, I'm not a real social person. It's a stretch for me to kind of get out there and drive these connections. If I go to a conference and if I had the choice to just sit on the wall and not just listen and not talk to anybody, it's probably my go-to. So it's a stretch. But as a result, therefore, when I do get set up in these discussions, I do try to make sure that I have an overt decision and discussion about what's that ongoing connection going to look like, because I know my default will be to not do it. And then it's like any other relationship. You'll find that some are great opportunities to stay connected and some are, I'll wait till next year when we're in the same meeting and maybe we'll say hi again.
I think that's great for people to hear, because we have quite a few listeners that said, I'm an introvert and I hate this stuff. I don't like it. And it's like, yeah, but you can still think about building maybe one meaningful connection rather than having to work a whole room. Yeah.
It is like the allyship though, right? Which is you have to be deliberate, right? I would say, in fact, when I go to some of these larger sponsored conferences, there's whoever the organizer is or whoever invites me, I ask them, I said, look, I'd like you to set up 4 or 5 meetings. I say, I don't know, whatever
That's a good
And
idea.
they love doing that. Like it feeds their beast to what they like to do, and it makes sure that I am right. Because again, and I've been to conferences. I think both of you guys. Absent that, I'm going to talk to the people I know, and it's great to catch up. But to be honest, I'm not building out my network. And I do think it's important that folks think about building out your network. It's not just like, oh, I'm out there working my career. It really is about learning, right? It is that opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked
Mm-hmm.
to my team now, and I've asked everybody. I said, every day on my team, I said, I want you guys to go to an external conference every year. And ideally, I'd like you to be working on presenting at them. I said, I don't care what the size of the conference is, but I think that it's good for the brand of our company if you're out there. But it's also a great learning opportunity. And there's different size conferences, but I think that idea about remembering that the game is played outside, that you have the opportunity to learn
Mm-hmm.
from other companies, big and small, is something that we're trying to reinforce within our team as well.
That's great. Such good advice. All right. So moving on. Last question here. We call this one Hero, Hardship, and Highlight. And so we actually heard this at a conference and we loved it because I think you get so many great insights from people with this one. So a hero is a person who has inspired or encouraged you to achieve something. A hardship is a difficult experience in your life, maybe something you learned about yourself through it. And then a highlight is a positive achievement or a proud
This
moment.
really feels like one of those questions I should have come in more prepared for.
When it coming in hot, we like it better that way.
Can I try the back part of that and work my way forward?
Sure.
Yeah.
Because hero is going to be the hardest question for me. Highlight. So I had very early on in my career, I came into an organization. They were getting ready to tear it down. And I was told there was one individual. And my boss said, and you're going to have to fire this guy because he's a total pain. He's very disruptive. And I don't think he's going to be worth keeping. Literally, as I was onboarding this new job as department manager, this is the person I was told I was going to have to fire. So I sat down with him, and he was pretty feisty, had a lot of arguments to have. But you begin to discover he's got a ton of knowledge and a ton of passion, right? And so it was that the identification was like, well, maybe actually there's an opportunity to use this more to my advantage versus disadvantage. The short story is that over time, we kind of moved into a process leader role and eventually promoted him from wage to salary as a process engineer, which was virtually unheard of in the facility I was working in at the time. He ended up eventually moving out of the plant to kind of continue on his process engineering work, expanded beyond the operation we were working in, and kind of becoming this both technical but also process expert in a number of other areas. And so, I was always a highlight for me, not necessarily because I did anything new or unique, but this idea that finding out what's driving somebody and then getting the best out of that was always just super exciting for me. Hardship. I talked about that whole experience of finding out we had no money to pay anymore. That was a pretty challenging dynamic. The other one is probably I came into the yogurt organization at the time when yogurt was like the best place to be. We're investing tons of money. We were hiring great people to work in the operation. But when I came in was right when Chobani was launching their products. And I think that I made half the rate of money versus my peers for the next 3 years because it was a really tough business environment. We were struggling to figure out how to make a competitive product. We had invested a ton of capital and assets in it, and it wasn't working. And it really highlighted this idea that you're always going to go through a business cycle, right? You're never going to be on top all the time. And therefore, one of the biggest things you can learn is how do you navigate in that space when things are tough? Because anyone can navigate when it's great, right? Coasting on the top of the wave is super easy. Swimming to the top of the wave or when you're getting tumbled down below it is much tougher. But it's also the reality is that you can do it and that it's possible and that it still gives you that opportunity to discover great people, build great skills, and get some good foundations behind things. So that's probably the hardship story. Hero. All right.
It can be personal or professional. It doesn't have to be work.
I know, but hero's always like a big tag for it.
It is. I hear you.
Hero, either one.
I could be stewing and brewing across it. So this may be less of a hero, but maybe a little bit of a hero, somebody I'm impressed with. So I work with a woman in our team, Tabitha Gomez, who just joined. She actually worked at P&G for a while and then came to us from Reckitt. And she came into our organization as the chief marketing officer. And she is, 5 feet tall. And just have in mind, my CEO is 6'7" or something, right? He's gigantic. So we have a whole group of men that are I'm probably the shortest guy on the leadership team. And Tabitha, and she's coming in as the head of marketing into a role that was never sat on our executive team before. But the way Tabitha shows up on the team in terms of bringing broader insight and then constantly, I would say, raising the bar on how we think about driving the business has been it's really been amazing. I seek to emulate the work that she does on a regular basis, but also I think this idea that you make the space that you want to navigate in. And so there's the lane that she's been kind of tasked to do, and she's constantly in there, I think, navigating the space more broadly, but in a way that is highly engaging. She brings other people along with her on the journey. I do think that it's an environment where potentially you can be really polarizing, or you can be really engaging, and I find that she is really able to bring others along in the journey. I know that it's a struggle, right? As she and I talk a fair amount about, there's always challenges in this space where you're having to make a place for yourself in a world that fundamentally what didn't exist before. And so I'm always inspired by that.
Oh, I love that story. All
Same.
right. What else does that?
I was going to ask a question. Okay, so for her, as you watch this, do you want to share like a specific story or example, like where you've seen her do this and you're like, nailed it, and I'm going to do that the next leadership team that I join or lead?
Ooh.
Or is there, in general, would you say specific capability or skill set that she exhibits that you're like, wow, these are things?
Like as she's bringing those people along, like how is she doing that without being
Yeah.
polarizing?
So, all right, I might be able to navigate somewhere in that space. So
Okay.
one of the things that I've seen her do is she's got a team, and it's this sort of disparate team because it's kind of been built and reformed over time. We just had an event at the end of last calendar year, and they had to come and present. She had clearly done a ton to prepare, and she's a VP of X, but so she's got multiple layers below her, but she clearly spent time preparing her team, some of which are more, I would say, they're analytic focused team. It's not like it's a whole bunch of, I would say, stereotypical sales and marketing people. She had taken time to prepare each one of them to show up in this meeting to be both effective in how they communicate, but also help them to connect the work that they were presenting with those things that we had been, we had been discussing or talking about in that time. And I think this idea about ensuring that the best leaders make sure that their organization shows up as successful was just super impactful for me. I also joke the fact that typically when we do global meetings, I always have to present after her. And so she is a much better presenter than I am. She's marketing, so there's always videos and fancy stuff. And so
Reels.
Massive thing with like Jason Kelsey, and then I have to present a scorecard with like stoplights on it. So there's an element of me trying to learn my way through how to be a better leader and communicator in that experience. But I do think this idea, and she and I have talked before about, there is that trade-off between, you don't want your organization feeling like when they present to some group of senior leaders that they have to be perfect, but it's balanced with the idea of, hey, but I'm prepared to help you prepare to make sure that you're more comfortable and more effective in that environment. I've typically been like, well, hey, I don't want you guys to think about this as a big deal. So I'm going to let you, we don't have to practice. You just go when you just, I'm confident. I support you and I'm confident in what you can do. The difference is that, so on one hand, it's pretty hands off. I'm not micromanaging it but I think what she has brought to light for me is there is a balance between that and helping them be prepared for themselves. Not be prepared for me, but really be prepared for themselves.
It's a great lesson. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Josh. This was amazing. And